Can researchers purposefully expose volunteers to a coronavirus or RSV? Let's first clarify this coronavirus is not the coronavirus that shut the world down in 2020. However, in the early 1990s, researchers Sheldon Cohen, David Tyrrell, and Andrew Smith investigated whether psychological stress predisposes you to developing symptoms after being exposed to viruses like the coronavirus. It was a bold experiment even at its time that has helped the psychological community develop a deeper understanding of the role of stress and our immune response. In his 1991 study entitled Psychological Stress and the Susceptibility to the Common Cold, Cohen, Tyrrell, and Smith studied subjects who volunteered for what is now known as the British Cold Study. The British Cold Study assessed volunteers between the ages of 18 and 54 from 1986 to 1989 to investigate the role that stress, amongst other variables, played in relation to the susceptibility of the common cold. Cohen and his colleagues studied 154 men and 266 women evaluated to be in good health. Volunteers were asked to fill out assessments of personality, stress, and their typical health practices. Stress measures asked three things. 1. How many stressors a person experienced in the last year that were overwhelming or uncontrollable? 2. Whether they were able to cope with existing demands placed on them. And 3. The degree to which they experienced emotions of anxiety, anger, guilt, hostility, sadness, and distress. Blood was also drawn to measure immune response. And this is when things got interesting. 394 of the subjects were given one of 5 respiratory viruses, including rhinovirus type 2, 9, or 14, or respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, or coronavirus type 229E. After the nasal drops were administered, the volunteers were quarantined in apartments, and each day the subjects were visited by a member of the study to assess clinical symptoms like sore throat, coughing, stuffiness, sneezing, and even the number of tissues were counted. This assessment happened daily, starting 2 days prior to the nose drops and 6 days after. On the 7th day after administration, subjects left quarantine and were followed up with 28 days later. The experimental subjects were compared to a smaller group of control subjects that were administered saline nasal drops. The study was double-blind, so neither participants nor the experimenters knew who was in each condition. So what did they find? Cohen and colleagues first identified whether subjects were infected or had symptoms of a cold. Infection rates were determined based on antibody levels, and symptoms of a cold were recorded by a physician or self-report. The authors found that participants' rate of infection and the development of cold symptoms increased with increases in participant stress index. In fact, it was the top 25% of participants on these stress indicators that were over 2 times more likely to get sick compared to the bottom 25%. Cohen wrote that stress is associated with the suppression of a general resistance process in the host, leaving persons susceptible to multiple infectious agents, or that stress is associated with the suppression of many different immune processes with similar results. Some 2 years later, Cohen followed this groundbreaking study with a 1993 publication entitled Negative Life Events, Perceived Stress, Negative Affect, and Susceptibility to the Common Cold, where the authors looked more closely at the role of one's stress index. Again, stressful life events were found to increase the susceptibility to colds. Adding to this stress-illness relationship, the authors found that one's affect was the primary mediator of the relation between stress and illness. The authors did emphasize that stressful life events ultimately predicted the development of clinical colds, and how one perceived their stress and demonstrated negative affect played a significant role as well. So what do we take away from these data? According to Cohen, one of the strongest predictors of developing infection and cold symptoms is stressful life events. Although Cohen does not mention advice for the readers, we can easily look to the literature on dealing with stress for help. To start, it's safe to say that most of us living on this planet will experience stressful life events. It's hard to think that we'll avoid stress in our lifetime. What we gain from reading Cohen's research is that it's imperative for our physiological and psychological health that we see through these stressors, instead of experiencing stress and having those experiences be the cause for us to isolate or see the world in a negative way. We find areas in our life that we can control, that we can change, And while we do so, we always focus on the positive, beautiful, and enriching experiences that we have, that we're patient and kind to ourselves, and engage in behaviors that represent our value. I hope you enjoyed this summary. Please add any comments or questions you have on this research, and write any requests for future videos. Please support the channel by liking and subscribing. It'd mean a lot to us.